All right, welcome back. Today you've got guided reading 10.3 due. You have 10.4 for tomorrow. So let's get in and review what we talked about yesterday, which was Martin Luther King. The leader of the civil rights movement was MLK. His plan called and included civil disobedience, which was not obeying unjust laws by using boycotts and protests, peaceful protests. True or false? The Supreme Court ruled public school segregation unconstitutional in the Brown versus Board of Education, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a separate but equal ruling. That is true. And what did the Voting Rights Act of 65 do? A. All right, so as we can see, this is titled Civil Rights Part 2, so we're going to continue talking about civil rights, but we're going to move on from Martin Luther King's peaceful protests to more violent protests, as well as we're going to talk about women's protests and Native Americans and Mexican Americans. So at the end of the day, you should be able to continue to create a timeline of key events, both from the protesters, important protesters and government laws, and then investigate additional marginalized groups such as the Native Americans, the Mexican Americans, and women. So review: the civil rights movement began after World War II, and the goal was equal treatment for blacks. And if you recall, during World War II, African Americans fought for what was known as the Double V campaign, victory against racism abroad with Nazism and fascism, and the treatment of the Jews during the Holocaust, and then fighting for victory against racism at home. So major steps: 1948, Truman desegregates the military. 54, we had Brown versus Board of Education, which led to public school integration, which would lead to other areas in public being integrated. 55, we had the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. We had the sit-ins, which were led by the SNCC, the Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 61, we had the national bus integration, which was promoted by and approved by JFK. 64, we had the Civil Rights Acts, which led to the end of Jim Crow law or segregation laws, and then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which led to more registration of African Americans and started breaking down black code laws. So, leader of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. Again, Martin Luther King's strategy was peaceful protests, boycotts, civil disobedience. Did everybody support MLK? Of course not. A lot of people thought it was too kind. Definitely wanted to see more action. Again, going back all the way to Unit 5, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois didn't get along. So radicalized groups criticized Martin Luther King for being too soft and not getting equality. So this is going to lead to the Black Power movement. And within the Black Power movement, we have two famous organizations. One is the Black Panther movement, and one is the Nation of Islam. So think about the Black Power movement being, social studies. And then you've got, under the social studies, you've got modern world history and you've got U.S. history. So U.S. history would be the Black Panthers. U.S. history would be the Nation of Islam underneath Malcolm X. So why did some civil rights activists challenge Martin Luther King? They disagreed with his approach, his nonviolent approach. Radical groups such as the Black Power movement, the Nation of Islam, goals of the Black Power movement, which is the social studies discipline, the overarching movement, was political independence, and political independence basically right now. Socialism, basically equality for minority and marginalized groups. So under the Black Panther strategy or movement was bombings, violent protests, assassinations. Again, so you can kind of start to see that the Black Power movement really was more towards Du Bois' way of doing things. Leaders of it, you started out with the Black Panther movement was started by a guy by the name of Huey Newton. Nation of Islam was Malcolm X. And then later on, Stokely Carmichael will take over the Black Panther movement. And did the public really react to Du Bois? If you recall, no. They didn't like it. And the reason they didn't like what was going on was it was violence. So the Black Power movement did not receive a lot of national support because of their militant ways. So mid-60s is really a turbulent time for the United States. A lot of people, influential figures involved in the civil rights movement at the government level are assassinated. You have JFK, who was assassinated in '63 in Dallas. His younger brother, Bobby, is assassinated a couple years later. And then Martin Luther King is actually assassinated a few years later. So between JFK and Martin Luther King, in a span of about 5 years, you have three prominent members of the government scene that are assassinated. And the country erupts in massive protests. Think on the scale, if you recall, the Black Lives Movement protests a couple of summers ago. So the public supported nonviolent protests. They did not support violent radicalisms. And in April of '68, the culminating event was Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, by a white supremacist and a Southerner. National reaction to MLK is riots afterwards. So we go from 63 to 68 of just having three major national leaders assassinated. So soon after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X actually does go and revert back to nonviolent protests and homage of Martin Luther King. So the civil rights movement loses support in the late '60s, and this is really what causes Malcolm X to kind of re-energize the movement. The civil rights movement loses support because of riots and violence and reduced white support. The white middle class is not really supportive of the violence, and radical Black Power movement scares the public. So let's move on to other civil rights movements. We're going to, again, talk about the Native Americans. We're going to talk about women, and we're going to talk about the Mexican Americans. So the women's rights movement is now going to be called NOW. And their slogan is going to be equality, the time is now. And the NOW stands for the National Organization of Women. We're going to talk about Latino rights or Mexican American movement under Cesar Chavez. And the Native American rights movement, very briefly touch on, but they are known as the AIM, American Indian Movement. and they aim at getting equality. This is a video about Cesar Chavez.
Cesar Estrada Chavez, an American civil rights activist and labor leader, was born in Yuma, Arizona on March 31st, 1927. The Chavez family lost their Arizona homestead in the Great Depression, and in the late 1930s moved to Northern California.
Cesar and his family became migrant farm workers thrust into the industrialized agriculture of California.
Cesar dropped out of school after the 8th grade to help support his family by working in the fields.
Cesar joined the Navy right after World War II, and he saw places he never would have seen. So it did open his eyes up to the world very much.
After the Navy, Chavez returned to the fields and became a grassroots organizer for a Latino civil rights group. He then left the group and formed the National Farm Workers Association, now known as the United Farm Workers of America, with the goal of unionizing farm workers.
Cesar believed that the movement he founded had to be more than just a union that was solely concerned with improving wages, hours, and working conditions, although the UFW certainly did that. But it also needed to address the crippling dilemmas that farm workers face in the community after they came home from work.
Most people were poor. They didn't have access to good housing or health care or education.
Chavez was adamant that his new union follow a strict policy of using only nonviolent tactics as a means of negotiation. While the organization was still in its infancy, the UFW embarked upon one of the most influential boycotts in U.S. history, the boycott of all California table grapes.
The Great Boycott really took off in '68. Cesar had studied history. He knew that for 100 years, farm worker strikes were brutally crushed, and that the agricultural industry, which in California is one of the richest, most powerful industries in the state, controlled much of rural California. So what Cesar needed to do was take the fight from the fields, where the odds were stacked against the farm workers, and move it to the cities, where the farm workers at least had a chance.
Over the next few years, led by Cesar Chavez, the farm workers would boycott, protest, march, and fast their way to a collective bargaining agreement, which guaranteed field workers, among other things, increased pay and the right to unionize.
He was responsible for a lot of the labor codes that we see today, the protections, the benefits, but the basic right to organize and affiliate.
As the head of the United Farm Workers of America, labor rights was not the only cause championed by Chavez.
Cesar's commitment to social justice went far beyond the farm workers. In the 1960s, he was a strong and vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. In the 1970s, Cesar was an early and vocal supporter of gay rights. Also not a popular position, especially at that time, among his own constituency.
Cesar Chavez died in his sleep on April 23, 1993. He was survived by his wife Helen, their 8 children, and 31 grandchildren. In 1994, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton.
In 1975, there was a reporter with a national news magazine following Cesar around for several days, rallies, marches, picket lines. And in an interview, she asked him what accounts for all the affection and respect that farm workers show you in public. And Cesar paused for a moment, and then he smiled his easy smile, and he said, "The feeling is mutual."
Mark Twain is now thought of as America's first celebrity because he was so good at capturing the public imagination, and it became important to him to have a public image.
So really what you need to know is for Cesar and the Mexican American movement is they galvanize, they unionize, and protect migrant farmers. So let's look at the women's movement. So the women faced discrimination, inequality, and especially over reproductive control over their bodies. Leaders during this time was a person by the name of Betty Friedan. Betty wrote in '63 The Feminine Mystique, which is a book about women's movement. In '66, she creates the National Organization for Women, which is, as I said, their protest chant, "We want our rights and we want them now." So the women's movement gained support in terms of equal pay, prohibiting wage disparity based on sex. They were able to use the Civil Rights Act, which banned discrimination based on sex. And then their major thing that they had to deal with was reproductive rights of their body and reproductive. And the famous court case during this time is Roe v. Wade. Now, both the Texas woman and the prosecutor, they changed their names in order to protect them because they faced threats of violence for doing what they did. Ms. Wade basically gets pregnant on purpose to have an abortion. And in the state of Texas during this time, in the 70s, it was illegal to have an abortion. So she wanted to just be like, Homer Plessy, Rosa Parks, and show how absurd a law was that they had no rights. So she gets pregnant, purposely has an abortion, and violates the law. So the reaction to Roe v. Wade, America today still is divided on whether or not we should allow babies to come to term or have an abortion. Just a few years ago, the Supreme Court said that it is the state's responsibility to make that decision, not the federal government. Where do the women fail to achieve equality? So women spoke urgently and against when Congress tried to create what was known as the Equal Rights Amendment. And because women spoke up against it, we did not pass the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment proposed equality for women, and it was really because of conservative women, leaders such as Phyllis Schlafly, who opposed it. And the impact launched the 1980s conservative revival, or the New Right movement. So the Civil Rights Movement, in conclusion, was started and began after World War II, led by Martin Luther King. We had violent protesters such as Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X. But Martin Luther King wanted to use nonviolent protests and gained national support. In '64, we had the Civil Rights Act that ended segregation. '65, we had the Voting Rights Act that led to more African Americans voting and removing of the Black Code laws, along with the 24th Amendment. Then we get the more violent Black Power movements under Nation of Islam and Black Panthers that started to portray violence and led to less support by white Americans. So in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, which led to massive riots across the states. Why did civil rights movements lose support in the 60s? Riots lost because of lack of support from the whites, because radical Black Power movement scared the public and used violence. And in 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized abortion with the controversial Roe v. Wade decision. All right, again, tomorrow you guys have guided reading 10.4. Be safe. Have a great day.